Mia never imagined freedom could feel this light, like shedding a heavy coat she'd worn for too many years. She stood in the middle of her tiny rented apartment, the hum of the city outside barely breaking through the silence. A second-hand coffee table, a few well-worn cookbooks, a potted plant gifted by a coworker, these were all she had to her name. But for the first time, she wasn't measuring her life in what she lacked. She was measuring it in what she had finally let go of. She sank onto the couch, letting the stillness settle around her. No voices calling her name, no endless demands, no weight of unspoken expectations pressing down on her shoulders. Just quiet. Just space that belonged to her alone. It was a foreign feeling, one she barely knew how to hold. Because for as long as she could remember, her life had been about serving others, about bending, breaking, and shrinking to fit inside a role she never chose. But how did she get here? What pushed her to walk away from the only life she'd ever known? To understand that, you'd have to go back. Back to when she was just 6 years old. Back to the moment she stopped being a child. Mia's earliest memory of responsibility wasn't something grand or dramatic. It was quiet. Subtle. A moment so small that no one noticed it but her. She was 6 years old, standing on tiptoes to reach the edge of the crib, peering down at the tiny, wrinkled faces of her newborn twin siblings, Lucas and Lily. Her father's hand rested on her shoulder, his voice warm but firm. "You're a big girl now, Mia," he told her. "They're going to need you." At the time, she had swelled with pride. The idea of being a big sister had felt like an honor, a special role just for her. She nodded eagerly, unaware of what those words truly meant. At first, it was simple. Fetching diapers when her mother called. Handing over toys to keep the twins from crying. Holding Lily's tiny hand while their parents finished making dinner. Each request felt like a game, a way to prove how helpful and grown-up she was. But somewhere along the way, the requests turned into expectations. The tiny tasks became daily chores. And before she realized it, Mia wasn't just helping, she was needed. "Mia, grab the baby wipes." "Mia, can you put Lucas to sleep?" "Mia, be a good girl and pick up the toys." The words blended together, forming an invisible contract she never signed. By the time she was 9, it was no longer "can you help?" It was "this is your job now." She learned how to make sandwiches before she could properly tie her shoes. She knew how to calm a tantrum better than she knew how to ride a bike. While other kids spent their afternoons running through sprinklers or riding scooters down the block, Mia was inside, folding tiny onesies and making sure the twins didn't put anything dangerous in their mouths. Her mother would sigh, exhausted after a long day. "You're such a good big sister, Mia," she would say, pressing a quick kiss to her forehead before heading off to rest. But being a good big sister didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like a job title. She started noticing things. How her parents could watch an entire movie uninterrupted while she was always on alert, making sure Lucas and Lily didn't hurt themselves. How her mother could take a nap on the couch while she sat on the floor entertaining the twins for hours. How, slowly, she was fading into the background, less of a child, more of a caretaker. Her birthdays were small. A single candle on a grocery store cake, a quiet dinner at home. But when Lucas and Lily's birthdays arrived, the entire neighborhood knew. There were balloons tied to the mailbox, a magician performing tricks in the backyard, and piles of brightly wrapped presents stacked taller than Mia herself. The first time she voiced her frustration, her mother brushed it off with a soft laugh. "Oh, sweetheart, it's different with them. They're younger. They need more excitement." Mia swallowed her feelings, the way she always did. But she couldn't ignore the way the scales tipped further and further in one direction. At 11, she was old enough to understand that some people in a family were cared for, and others were the ones who did the caring. She had no doubt where she stood. And so, she adjusted. She became the girl who didn't ask for much. The girl who kept her head down, did what was expected, and carried the weight of her family on small, tired shoulders. But weight only gets heavier. And eventually, if you carry it long enough, you break. Before I share what happened next, the moment that made me realize I was never meant to just exist for someone else's benefit, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like you were giving more than you were receiving? Drop a raised hand in the comments if you've ever carried responsibilities that weren't meant to be yours. And if you know what it's like to feel invisible, hit that like button, because trust me, this story is just getting started. Mia had never been the kind of child who expected much. By the time she turned 11, she had already learned that disappointment stung less when you saw it coming. Her birthday was on a Tuesday that year. The air was thick with summer heat, the kind that made everything feel slower, heavier. When she came downstairs that morning, there was no excitement in the air, no streamers, no decorations. Just a small grocery store cake sitting on the kitchen counter, its plastic lid fogged from the refrigerator. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," her mother said, kissing her on the forehead as she stirred a pot of oatmeal. "We'll have cake after dinner." That was it. No presents waiting on the table, no stack of brightly wrapped boxes. Her father came home late that evening, tossing her a small, second-hand book he had found on sale. "Heard it's a classic," he said with a grin. She forced herself to smile, murmuring a quiet thank you before flipping through the worn pages, the faint scribbles from its previous owner still etched inside. The only real gift she received was from her best friend, Ava, who had come over for a few hours. She had woven a bracelet out of tiny colored threads, tying it around Mia's wrist with a proud smile. "Now you'll always have something from me," she had said. Mia clung to those words as she blew out her candle, her wish already forming before the flame had even died. "Please, just once, let me feel special." A month later, she learned what special really looked like. Lucas and Lily were turning 6, and it was as if the entire world revolved around them. For weeks, her mother planned every detail, the invitations, the decorations, the entertainment. The backyard transformed into a carnival, complete with balloon animals, a magician, and a bounce house that stood so tall it cast a shadow over the entire lawn. Mia watched as her mother arranged the cupcakes, each one carefully decorated with the twins' initials. She watched as her father set up a table overflowing with presents, bright, shiny packages that made her stomach twist. There were 20 guests, kids from their preschool running wild across the grass. 2 cakes, one for each twin, decorated in their favorite themes. Hours of celebration, filled with laughter, games, and attention showered on Lucas and Lily like they were royalty. And then, there was Mia. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't even a sibling, not really. She was the one passing out juice boxes, making sure the kids didn't fight over toys, cleaning up the discarded wrapping paper after the presents had been torn open. It wasn't until the last guest had left that she realized something. No one had even said her name all day. As she picked up empty plates and deflated balloons, she wondered what it must feel like, to be celebrated like that. To be the kind of person people made a big deal over. She thought back to her own birthday, the dimly lit kitchen, the quiet dinner, the single candle on a cake that had been picked up as an afterthought. And she knew, in that moment, that love in her family was not equal. Lucas and Lily were cherished. They were adored. They were wanted. And Mia? Mia was useful. She stared down at the pile of discarded ribbons and torn up gift wrap, something hollow settling deep in her chest. It wasn't just about birthdays. It was about what they deserved versus what she did. That night, when she climbed into bed, she traced her fingers over the thin bracelet Ava had given her, the only gift that had meant something. And for the first time, she let herself admit the truth, maybe I was never meant to be celebrated. Mia woke up before the sun most mornings, long before the rest of the house stirred. The world outside was still wrapped in quiet, but inside, there was always something that needed to be done. Lunches to be packed. Clothes to be folded. Messes to be cleaned before anyone even noticed they were there. By the time she turned 13, her role in the family had been cemented. She wasn't just an older sister anymore, she was the caretaker, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly. Her mother had a way of phrasing it that made it sound like an honor. "You're so responsible, Mia. I don't know what we'd do without you." But responsibility wasn't something she had chosen. It was something that had been placed on her shoulders, piece by piece, until the weight of it was all she knew. Every morning, she woke Lucas and Lily up, helped them get dressed, and made their breakfast. While they yawned and stretched at the kitchen table, she rushed to pack their lunches before throwing together something quick for herself, usually whatever scraps were left over. Then she walked them to school, hurrying back just in time to make it to her own. After the final bell rang, while her classmates went home to finish homework, watch TV, or talk on the phone for hours, Mia's day was just getting started. She rushed to pick up the twins, helped them with their assignments, and started preparing dinner long before her parents even stepped through the door. By the time her mother and father finally arrived, exhausted from work, the house was spotless, the kids were taken care of, and dinner was waiting on the table. And yet, no one ever asked how her day had been. Mia couldn't remember the last time she had been asked about school, about friends, about the things that mattered to her. It was as if she existed only in relation to the things she could do for others. "You're such a lifesaver," her mother would say, taking her seat at the table. "Good girl," her father would add, digging into his meal. Mia would force a smile, her stomach twisting at how easily the words rolled off their tongues. They thought they were giving her praise. They thought they were acknowledging her. But all she heard was confirmation of what she already knew. They saw her as useful, not as someone who needed care herself. It wasn't until she turned 16 that things somehow got worse. Her parents sat her down at the kitchen table one evening, their expressions grave. "Mia, we need to talk," her father began, his fingers tapping against the wooden surface. She glanced at Lucas and Lily, who were curled up on the couch watching TV, oblivious to whatever serious discussion was about to take place. "We're having some financial struggles," her mother said, her voice tight. "We need you to start working after school to help with expenses." Mia blinked, trying to process the words. "But I already take care of the house. And the twins." "You'll still do that," her father said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "But we need you to contribute financially, too." Mia felt something inside her sink. She had expected a lot from them over the years, but this? "What about my schoolwork?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "You'll figure it out," her mother replied, dismissing her concern without a second thought. And just like that, her life shifted again. The next day, she applied for a job at a small diner a few blocks from home. The owner, an older man named George, hired her on the spot. "Hard work builds character," he said with a nod, handing her an apron. Mia wasn't sure what kind of character was left to build. Her routine became brutal. School all day. Work until closing. Home to clean and take care of Lucas and Lily. Homework squeezed into the late hours of the night, her eyes burning from exhaustion. Every paycheck went straight into her parents' hands. At first, she didn't question it. It was for the family, after all. That's what she had been told. But the first time she asked if she could keep a little, just a small portion for herself, her mother's face darkened. "We put a roof over your head," she snapped. "We feed you. That money belongs to the family." Mia didn't argue. She just nodded and swallowed the lump in her throat. It wasn't until weeks later, after building up the courage, that she finally tried again. "I'm working hard," she said, carefully choosing her words. "Could I at least have a little to save? Maybe just $100 a week?" Her mother sighed like she was dealing with the most selfish request in the world. But in the end, she agreed, shoving a few bills into Mia's hand like she was handing crumbs to a beggar. "This is a privilege," she warned. "Don't ask for more." Mia stared down at the money, her fingers tightening around it. It was the first thing she had ever earned that she got to keep. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like permission to exist. But deep down, she knew this wasn't normal. She just wasn't ready to admit it yet. Mia dragged herself home after another grueling shift at the diner, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. The scent of grease and coffee clung to her clothes, her fingers sore from hours of scrubbing dishes and wiping down tables. The only thing on her mind was food. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, there had been no time between school and work. Now, all she wanted was a plate of something, anything, before collapsing into bed. But the moment she stepped through the front door, she knew something was wrong. Her family was seated around the dinner table, their plates nearly empty, their faces set in deep disapproval. Lucas slouched in his chair, lazily poking at the last scraps of mashed potatoes on his plate. Lily crossed her arms, lips pressed into a pout. And her parents, her mother sat rigid, hands folded in her lap, while her father simply glared. Mia barely had time to set down her backpack before her mother's voice cut through the silence. "You didn't make dinner." Mia blinked, too exhausted to process what she had just heard. "What?" Her father sighed like he was dealing with a stubborn child. "You know dinner is your responsibility, Mia." Something inside her snapped. She let out a dry, disbelieving laugh. "Are you serious?" She gestured at the empty plates in front of them. "You're all grown adults. The twins are 15. None of you could figure out how to make a sandwich?" Silence. The air in the room thickened, tense and unyielding. Then, her mother pushed back her chair and stood, her face a mask of icy disapproval. "Don't you dare take that tone with us," she said sharply. "This is our house, and you will show respect." Mia wanted to scream. Respect? Respect for what? For the way they drained every ounce of energy from her? For the way they treated her as if she were nothing more than an unpaid maid? She clenched her fists, her pulse roaring in her ears. "I went to school all day," she said, voice dangerously low. "Then I worked a 6-hour shift. I just got home, starving, and the first thing you say to me is that I should have made dinner?" Her father leaned back, arms crossed. "You know how things work in this house, Mia." Oh, she knew. She had known for years. And she was so damn tired of it. Before she could say another word, her father reached for his phone, dialing a number with calm indifference. "2 large pizzas," he said into the receiver. "Extra cheese." Mia stared at him, waiting. Waiting for him to say one word that included her. But the order was placed for 3 people. Not 4. She felt her stomach tighten, the weight of their message hitting her with the force of a freight train. They weren't just dismissing her. They were punishing her. Her mother sat back down as if the issue had been resolved. "Go to your room, Mia." Go to her room? No dinner, no discussion, nothing? She wanted to fight, to throw something, to demand they see her for once. But what was the point? They never had before. So, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked to the kitchen. She made herself a cup of tea, the only thing she could stomach, and sat at the counter while the smell of pizza filled the house. She heard laughter from the dining room, the sound of her family enjoying their meal, without her. And that was when it truly sank in. She was not part of this family. She was part of the workforce that kept this house running. That night, as she lay in bed, her stomach aching from hunger, she stared at the ceiling, the cracks in the plaster looking bigger than they had the night before. This wasn't just unfair. It was wrong. And if she didn't do something soon, this would be the rest of her life. Mia stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the simple blue dress she had saved up for. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a plain, knee-length dress she had bought on sale with the small amount of money she had been allowed to keep. But it was hers. She had paid for it with her own hard-earned tips, and that alone made it feel special. Today was supposed to be a milestone, a moment of celebration. Graduation. For most of her classmates, it was the beginning of something new: college, internships, road trips with friends. Their families were throwing parties, giving them gifts, taking them out to dinner. Mia? Mia would be heading to work after the ceremony. She had already memorized the timeline. The moment she walked across that stage, shook hands with the principal, and held that diploma in her hands, her parents would be waiting, ready to rush home because Lucas had a soccer game in an hour. She should have been used to it by now. But as she watched herself in the mirror, smoothing down the fabric of her dress, she couldn't ignore the dull ache creeping into her chest. She wanted someone to be proud of her. The ceremony was exactly what she expected. Her parents arrived at the last possible second, sitting stiffly in the back while other families cheered, clapped, and took endless pictures. When Mia's name was called, she walked across the stage, feeling the weight of the diploma in her hands. For a brief second, she imagined what it would be like if her parents actually cared. If they were waiting outside with balloons and warm hugs, telling her how proud they were. If they had planned a dinner just for her. Instead, as soon as the speeches ended, her mother glanced at her watch. "We need to get going," she said as Mia approached. "Lucas's game starts soon." And just like that, they left. Mia stood there in her blue dress, surrounded by classmates taking pictures with their families, their faces glowing with excitement. She had never felt more alone. That night, instead of celebrating, she tied her apron around her waist and took orders at the diner. George, the owner, raised an eyebrow when he saw her. "Mia, what are you doing here? Didn't you graduate today?" She gave a small shrug. "I need the money." George studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "You're one of my best workers, you know that?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thanks." "You ever think about what's next?" he asked, leaning against the counter. Mia hesitated. Next? No one had ever asked her that before. Her entire life had been about what her family needed, never about what she wanted. George wiped his hands on a towel. "My cousin Noah owns a restaurant downtown. Real nice place. He's always looking for good staff. Pays better than here." Mia blinked, unsure if she had heard him right. "You mean I could work there?" "I'll put in a word for you," George said with a nod. "You deserve better than this place." The words lodged in her chest, unfamiliar yet comforting. No one had ever offered her anything before. No one had ever invested in her future. 2 weeks later, Mia stepped into Noah's restaurant for the first time. It was nothing like the greasy diner she was used to. The kitchen was bustling, the air thick with the scent of roasted garlic, fresh herbs, and sizzling butter. The servers moved with precision, their trays carrying dishes plated with artistic detail. Noah, a tall man with sharp eyes but a warm smile, gave her a nod as she entered. "You're Mia, huh? George says you're a hard worker." "Yes," she said quickly. I won't disappoint you." He studied her for a moment, then gestured toward the kitchen. "Let's see what you can do." Mia expected to start at the bottom, washing dishes, cleaning tables. But Noah must have seen something in her, because by the end of the week, he had her plating appetizers and learning how to pair flavors. For the first time, she was doing something for herself. But freedom wasn't so easily won. The moment her parents saw her paycheck, they were thrilled. "This is great," her father said, skimming over the numbers. "You'll be able to contribute even more now." And just like that, they expected every cent. Mia stared at them, something bitter crawling up her throat. She had worked for this. She had earned this. And yet, they still saw it as theirs. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. For years, she had convinced herself that this was normal, that giving everything to her family was just what she was supposed to do. But now, she wasn't so sure. Because for the first time in her life, someone else had seen potential in her. And she wasn't sure she could keep pretending that didn't matter. Mia had spent years convincing herself that things would change. That one day, her parents would wake up and realize how much she had sacrificed. That they would look at her, not as a worker, not as someone to rely on, but as their daughter. That hope shattered the night of Lucas and Lily's 16th birthday. She had planned ahead, volunteering to work a double shift at the restaurant. It was easier that way. Easier to avoid the celebrations, easier to pretend she didn't care. By the time she got home, the house was a disaster. Deflated balloons littered the floor, cake crumbs were smeared across the counter, and wrapping paper was torn apart in every corner of the living room. A few of the twins' friends were still hanging around, laughing, their voices blending into the low hum of music still playing from the speakers. Mia slipped into the kitchen, exhausted and starving. There were a few slices of cold pizza left on a plate, and for once, she didn't overthink it, she just grabbed one and sat down at the table, ready to eat something for the first time all day. Then her mother walked in. "Oh, good, you're home," she said, breezing past Mia to grab a dish towel. "The kids made a mess in the living room. Can you start cleaning up?" Mia didn't look up. She just took a bite of the pizza. "After I eat." Her mother turned, frowning. "Mia, now." Mia chewed slowly, swallowing down something heavier than food. "I've been working all day. I haven't eaten." "You can eat later. The guests are still here, and the house is a disaster." Mia let out a sharp breath, her fingers tightening around the crust of the pizza. "So let Lucas and Lily clean it." Her mother let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "They shouldn't have to, Mia. It's their birthday." Mia pushed back her chair, standing so abruptly that the leg scraped against the floor. "And what about my birthday?" Her voice was sharp, unsteady. "Where was my party? My decorations? My gifts?" Her mother blinked, caught off guard. "Mia, don't be dramatic." "Dramatic?" Mia let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "You spent weeks planning this party. You spent money, on decorations, on catering, on gifts that cost more than I've ever held in my hands. But when I turned 16, all I got was a cake from the grocery store and a second-hand book." Her mother's face hardened. "We do what we can, Mia. You know we've always struggled financially." Mia's chest tightened. "Right. And that's why every paycheck I've earned since I was 16 has gone straight into your hands." She looked past her mother, to the living room where the twins were laughing with their friends. And yet somehow, there was enough for this. Her father walked in then, hearing the raised voices. "What's going on?" Mia turned to him, her pulse roaring in her ears. "That's what I'd like to know." She gestured toward Lucas and Lily. "When do they start contributing? When do they get a job to help the family?" Her parents exchanged a glance. Then her father let out a slow sigh, as if he were speaking to someone too naive to understand. "Mia, your brother and sister have bright futures ahead of them. They need to focus on school." The words hit like a slap. She had worked. She had sacrificed. She had given them everything. And yet, she had never been seen as someone with a future. Just someone to make sure everyone else had one. Mia inhaled sharply, her decision solidifying like cement in her chest. She turned, walked to the sink, and began rinsing off her plate. The sound of running water filled the silence behind her. Her mother sighed, relieved, thinking Mia had backed down. "Good. Now, when you're done with that, start with the living room." "No." The single word cut through the room like a knife. Her mother stiffened. "Excuse me?" Mia turned around, drying her hands on a dish towel with deliberate slowness. "I'm not cleaning up. I'm not working myself to the bone while they sit around doing nothing." Her father's expression darkened. "Mia, you don't get to just decide." "I do," she interrupted, her voice steady. "I do get to decide." She tossed the dish towel onto the counter, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Because I'm done." Silence. Her mother frowned. "What do you mean, done?" Mia met her gaze, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely certain. "I mean, I'm leaving." The words hung in the air, thick and final. Her mother's face twisted in disbelief. "Mia, don't be ridiculous." But Mia wasn't listening. She walked past them, past the living room, up the stairs to her bedroom. She pulled out a suitcase from under her bed and started packing. It didn't take long. Because after 18 years in this house, she had shockingly little to show for it. She didn't leave a note. She didn't say goodbye. She just walked out. And for the first time, the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. Mia stepped out into the night, the weight of her suitcase in one hand and her phone in the other. The air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the occasional burst of laughter from somewhere down the block. For the first time in her life, she had nowhere to go, but she was finally free. She took a shaky breath and dialed the only number she could think of. Zara picked up after 2 rings. Mia? Mia's voice wavered. Hey. I left. There was a pause. Then, without hesitation, Zara said, "Where are you?" "I'm coming to get you." 20 minutes later, Zara pulled up in her beat-up sedan, her music still playing low in the background. She barely let Mia set her suitcase down before pulling her into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. The words hit Mia harder than she expected. No one had ever said that to her before. They drove through the city in comfortable silence, the streetlights casting fleeting patterns across the dashboard. When they reached Zara's apartment, a cozy little place cluttered with books, mismatched throw blankets, and half-drunk cups of coffee, Mia felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Relief. The spare bedroom was small, barely more than a mattress on the floor and a tiny dresser shoved against the wall, but to Mia, it felt like an entire kingdom. "I'll pay rent," she said, setting her bag down. "Half, or whatever's fair." Zara waved her off. "We'll figure it out later. Just rest. You need it." Mia nodded, but even as exhaustion pulled at her, sleep didn't come easy that night. Because for the first time, she had no obligations. No alarms to set so she could wake up before the twins. No meals to cook, no house to clean, no paycheck to surrender. Just silence. Just space. Just her. The next morning, she woke up to the smell of coffee. "Come on," Zara called from the kitchen. "We're gonna be late for work." Mia blinked, pushing off the blankets. Work. A place where she was valued, where she was good at what she did, where she wasn't just expected to give and give and give without thanks. As they walked into the restaurant that afternoon, Noah raised an eyebrow. "You look different." Mia smiled. "I moved out." He didn't press for details, just nodded approvingly. "Good for you. Now, get to work. We're slammed tonight." She threw on her apron, rolled up her sleeves, and got to it. And for the first time, the exhaustion felt different. This wasn't draining. This was building something. But freedom came at a price. By the time she clocked out, her phone was filled with missed calls. 20. All from her parents. Zara glanced at the screen. "You gonna answer?" Mia hesitated, then sighed. "Might as well get it over with." She hit accept. "Hello?" Her mother's voice wasn't worried. It was angry. "Where the hell are you?" Mia exhaled. "I moved out." Silence. Then, "Don't be ridiculous. You can't just leave." "I did." "Mia, who's going to cook? Who's going to clean?" "You could try doing it yourselves," she said, keeping her voice calm. "Or maybe Lucas and Lily could pitch in. They're old enough." Her mother scoffed. "They shouldn't have to." "Neither should I." Another pause. Then, her mother's tone shifted, softened. "Sweetheart, come home. We can talk about this properly." Mia shook her head, even though her mother couldn't see it. "No." She hung up. The calls continued for days, then weeks, but Mia never answered. She didn't need to. Instead, she focused on herself. She worked hard at the restaurant, soaking up every bit of knowledge Noah threw her way. She saved every dollar she could, no longer handing over her paycheck to people who never appreciated it. And a year later, standing in the middle of her own apartment, surrounded by furniture she bought with her own money, Mia finally realized something. She hadn't just left her family. She had chosen herself. And for the first time, that was enough. Mia sat on the floor of her apartment, a takeout box of pasta in one hand, a glass of cheap red wine in the other. Around her, the soft glow of string lights illuminated the small but cozy space, her space. The couch was second-hand, the coffee table slightly wobbly, and the kitchen shelf stocked with a mix of thrifted dishes and restaurant-grade knives she had saved up for. It wasn't much. But it was hers. She twirled a forkful of pasta, letting the silence settle around her. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of her childhood home, the kind that came with unspoken obligations and unacknowledged sacrifices. No, this was a different kind of quiet. One that felt peaceful. One that felt earned. A year ago, she had walked out of her parents' house with nothing but a suitcase and a certainty that she deserved more. Now, she was an assistant chef at Noah's restaurant, learning, growing, creating. Every dish she plated, every sauce she perfected, every skill she mastered, it was all leading to something that was hers alone. A future of her own making. Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen. An unfamiliar number. Against her better judgment, she answered. Hello? A pause. Then, a voice she hadn't heard in months. Mia, it's Mom. She exhaled, already knowing what was coming. We need to talk about Lucas and Lily's college tuition, her mother said, her voice all business. They'll be starting next fall, and we need your help. Mia almost laughed. Almost. Of course, that's why she was calling. Not to ask how Mia was. Not to apologize. Not to make amends. Just to take from her. Again. I'm not paying for their college, Mia said simply, twirling her pasta as if the conversation wasn't even worth pausing for. Her mother's voice sharpened. Mia, family helps family. Mia tilted her head, considering that. Like how you helped me with college? Silence. We did what we could, her mother finally said, her tone defensive. No, Mia corrected. You did what was convenient for you. There's a difference. Her mother huffed. Lucas and Lily have real potential. Mia's stomach twisted, not in pain, not in anger. In clarity. Because there it was. The truth, laid bare. They deserve the best, her mother continued, voice pleading now. And we. Mia cut her off. I deserved the best too. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unmovable. Then, for the first time in her life, Mia made the choice that had always been denied to her. She chose herself. I'm not giving you another cent, she said. I'm done. Her mother's voice rose, sharp with desperation. Mia, don't you dare hang up on me. Click. She blocked the number. Then, just for good measure, she changed her own. As she took another sip of wine, a slow smile spread across her face. She had left that life behind. And for the first time, she wasn't looking back. Mia stepped out onto her small balcony, the night air crisp against her skin. Below, the city pulsed with life, car horns, distant laughter, the steady rhythm of a world moving forward. And for the first time, she was moving with it. She leaned against the railing, staring at the skyline, the lights flickering like tiny reminders that there was so much more waiting for her beyond the walls of her past. She had spent years believing that love was something you earned, that if she worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, gave enough, maybe then she would matter. But love wasn't supposed to be a transaction. Family wasn't supposed to feel like a debt you could never repay. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't even angry anymore. She was free. As she took a deep breath, a thought surfaced, one she had buried for too long, one she finally allowed herself to feel. I don't miss my family. I miss who I could have been if they had loved me right. But now? I'm becoming that person on my own. She smiled to herself, turned, and walked back inside, into a life that, for the first time, belonged to her and her alone.